Martin Niemöller was a prominent Lutheran pastor in Germany. In the 1920s and early 1930s, he sympathized with many Nazi ideas and supported radical right-wing political movements. After Hitler came to power, he became an outspoken critic of Hitler's interference with the Protestant church. He spent 8 years of Nazi rule in prisons and concentration camps, but he's best remembered for the statement, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Russia seems condemned to repeat the mistakes of history rather than learning from them, as evidenced by Putin's mass mobilization of Russian males into the armed forces and the shock and panic it has prompted within Russia. Today, I'm discussing the political, social, and psychological impact of mobilization in Russia with social philosopher and popular YouTuber Vlad Vexler. His content is created for reflective people who feel the present resources for making sense of our world are inadequate, and his content is both informative and entertaining at the same time. Please do definitely check out his channel on YouTube, which is absolutely fabulous. And of course, please subscribe to this channel if you found this video interesting, so you could be notified about more of the content we create. So Vlad, let's jump into mobilization, because this is a sort of tipping point, isn't it? Something fundamental has changed in the last week.
It has, and what's changed is a kind of informal deal that Putin had with his people. Roughly that there was an extent to which he was going to stay out of their lives, and in exchange for that, they were going to outsource politics to him. And now, this deal has been, I would say, not yet broken, but cracked. Whether it's broken, I think, depends on how many people get mobilized, in what numbers they die, and whether at the end of that, this is really the key issue, and for me, this is bigger than the mobilization in terms of the destabilization of the Putin regime, whether there's going to be a moment in a few months where it's perceived that the mobilization has been absorbed by the war and hasn't changed the course of the war. And it's at that point, despite the protest we're seeing now, that I expect that real perception of fracture in that deal that Putin has with the people to appear. So mobilization is very, very challenging for the Russian political system, for Russian society to absorb, but more challenging will be the realization that it has not worked. And if and when that comes along, we're going to have a level of instability in Russia that we haven't seen for a long time. And in terms of these thoughts about how if you stay out of politics, politics comes for you, I think there is a kind of middle distance lesson here, which is that little by little, the Russian population ceded monopoly over the political process to the regime and excluded themselves from it. And at the early stages of that process, they still had the possibility to have a say and to alter that course. Now it's too late. We're going to have to wait for the regime to develop more fractures, and then people can act, and then protests can transfer from being expressions of discontent to being something politically constructive enough to potentially even get rid of the regime. But this is a tragic lesson of the costs of a pattern of depoliticization, which in its early years was something that did involve, I think, a choice for many Russian citizens. And so I think that is a lesson that all of us can take away. but it's a particularly tragic way in which it's manifested. It's manifested for Russians, because we can just shrug our shoulders and say somewhat brutally, this can be where it ends. This is one of the consequences of, if you like, semi-voluntarily stepping out of politics. So that's the sort of poetry of it. And in terms of the politics of it, I think that we're waiting for mobilization to be coupled with its perceived and recognized futility.
And I think because we tend to think of autocracy in very black and white terms, I think people will find it a strange idea that, you know, an autocracy and like Putin's Russia, and it's been clear for a long time that it's, you know, it's perhaps even gone beyond the hybrid democracy. They'll find it odd that there's this concept of a social contract, that right up until this year, there is a sort of unspoken agreement between ruler and ruled, that certain parts of their lives are ceded to him, but he doesn't encroach on other parts of their lives. So is it a point where a sort of unspoken social contract has been torn up this week?
I think what's been torn up is something more like an informal deal. I think it's too much to call it a social contract. But the RAF pattern with a lot of these imitative autocracies that pretend to be democracies but aren't at all, and autocracies that pretend to be authoritarian regimes but are authoritarian regimes only in a somewhat imitative, semi-functional way, they are reliant on not doing anything that dramatically pisses off their citizens. And so they are free to conduct wars so long as these wars don't sort of end up taking people out of their private lives and send them to the front. They're free to do political and economic restructurings of various kinds, as long as people are still allowed to subsist, and as long as people are allowed to have a modicum of freedom in the non-political sphere. So what these regimes almost invite you into is saying, you're going to get quite a bit of, if you like, private freedom in exchange for giving up on political freedom. And I think that that deal has been cracked, because it's absolutely an essential part of that deal that the regime doesn't have the authority to come and take possession of your body, come and take possession of you biologically. And that is why, for the first time, mechanisms of the regime that ordinarily work are ceasing to work. So let's just take one example. Russian propaganda. Russian propaganda has changed in one significant respect since the mobilization was announced. And that's that the focus is now not on Ukraine, but on a direct confrontation with NATO and the West. But there is another change that's really interesting. And that's that the usual method of saturating the informational environment with incompatible messages that normally works to depoliticize the population and sort of soothe them is having the opposite effect.
What they're hearing, scaring them.
I think it's panicking them. And what's interesting is that normally, when Russians hear 4 different stories from the same propagandist in 1 week, they have the inclination to say, well, this is confusing, I'm just going to stay out of it and get back to my sofa and watch the TV and, you know, look after my family. And that's why Russians can absorb stories about, you know, why a passenger jet is shot down that's changed day by day. Oh, these people did it. Oh, those people did it. Oh, that's how it happened. But now, incompatible messaging about what mobilization is for, who is getting mobilized, what numbers are getting mobilized, are sounding to Russians like, you're going to die, you're not going to die, you're going to die, you're not going to die, you're going to die, you're not going to die. And there is a certain kind of panic and a complete spluttering in the efficacy of propaganda that I haven't seen since the 90s in Russia. I have never seen Russian propaganda. It will recover. It will start doing some things well again. But I have never seen such a clear spluttering in the efficacy of this fairly effective, what Peter Pomerantsev might say, postmodernist propaganda. I've never seen it lose efficacy to this degree. And what normally soothes people, that very same method is panicking them at the moment. Now, that's going to have to be rectified by the regime, either by changing the subject or by clarifying their method about mobilization. Because at the moment, there is a kind of oscillation between existential war and only one slice of marmalade out of a whole pack being the subject matter of our conversation, which means nobody should really be worried. It's just one little slice, one little chip out of a pack of chips. And so that's been the message that's been pushed onto Russian influencers who are getting a small amount of money to post this stuff on the internet. It's been the same script. And this oscillation between this is nothing and this is everything, that very small number of people are getting mobilized and it's time to put the nation on a war footing. That combined with the arbitrariness of which people are picked up is causing a lot of discomfort, even I think in Moscow and Petersburg, where a much smaller percentage are being picked up, but where it's still arbitrary enough for people to feel very uncomfortable. So I haven't seen propaganda fail in quite the way it's failing today.
And some of those, it could be just anecdotal stories that are driving that sort of crack. But I guess people are thinking that, you know, if someone of non-draft age, you know, in their 50s is being called up, if someone with a, you know, a metal plate in their chest or some kind of severe medical condition, if people who are clearly shouldn't be on the draft are actually being mobilized, then, you know, if you're able-bodied in your 30s, you think, well, that's, you know, well, they're definitely going to call me up then if they're calling up that guy down the street who is clearly ineligible.
So I think this isn't a series of glitches. I think this is a systemic problem. And the problem is that this is done almost with a Soviet-style bureaucratic approach. Quotas are being released system, to the regions. Yeah. And it's a matter of pragmatic local politics, how the quotas are being fulfilled. And so you genuinely end up with stories where people are being just picked up from their villages, and in a village of a couple of dozen people, you might have, you know, a quarter of the men taken away all of the sudden. And there isn't much control of this from the center, which shows that for all of this sort of perception of imperialistic verticality, this is a regime that does not have a bureaucracy it can control from the center. This is a regime that actually lacks effective tentacles that can spread across the whole empire or the whole country. So what they're now doing is looking at regions that are in a critical condition with protest and discontent, and they're going to try to simply rebalance the situation by putting the focus on other regions where there isn't discontent and where more people can be taken. But there isn't a clear idea of principles along which regions fulfill the quotas. And the fact that this is a very decrepit Soviet-style bureaucracy, these conscription centers, makes it even worse. I mean, they barely know, you know, who to reach out to in their local area. I bet their own databases aren't properly integrated. So many people are getting these notices without their name on it, just their address. So they don't even know who is living where. And what they are relying on is basically that whatever is locally the path of the least resistance will get them enough people. So if people are voluntarily coming to these centers in sufficient numbers, just grab them. Doesn't matter who they are. If they're 7 years old or 77, it doesn't matter. Just take them all. And if that hasn't worked, well, what's the next path of least resistance? And that's therefore not a glitch. That's how this thing works. And it's not clear how they can easily rectify this in a systemic way. It's just going to have to be a kind of triage, and they're going to see if they can quell the discontent. But it looks ugly. It has a kind of genocidal aspect, the gross ethnic inequality of the people who are being picked out, and it's a particular shock, I think, to Russians because their approach to the war has been denial. And therefore, they're being picked up for something that to go somewhere, or potentially, about which they don't really want to have any conscious thoughts. So that's making it making it worse. But in terms of the glitchiness of it, I think that's a systemic problem, and they're pretty screwed with it.
We'll come back to that because I think that there's absolutely the arbitrariness and the aspect of that conscription is absolutely terrible, and that's what's really scaring people. But reading Peter Pomerantsev, you mentioned earlier, I mean, he's got this amazing theory that through the Soviet Union, people had to compartmentalize different parts of their lives. So you had a public face, you had a private face, you were a different person depending on the environment where you were. And so people have been tuned to perhaps contain, multiple conflicting identities within themselves, and they're able to somehow reconcile those or put them in different compartments. And I think what you said about the war is interesting. Up until now, it's been a TV war. You could be a patriot. You could broadly support the imperial goals. You could watch a TV entertainment format and be horrified and entertained at the same time. You could watch a propagandist say half a dozen impossible contradictory things for breakfast and somehow fit it all in your head and make sense of it, or just view it as throwaway entertainment. Now, suddenly, that's come from being an abstract thing totally outside of yourself to directly impinging you or your children who might be under threat of being taken away. And that suddenly makes it quite real. Doesn't necessarily mean that people are suddenly going to jettison the imperial views or suddenly be less patriotic. They're still going to try and be both at the same time. I'm a patriot, but I'm going to flee and not do my duty.
Well, I think Peter Pomerantsev's starting point is absolutely correct, which is that in some ways it's the wrong question to ask how many Russians are in favor and how many Russians are against the war. I think it's fair to say that probably is a fair question for, let's say, 35 to 50% of the population, which you can break down into being for or against the war. The rest of the population are in a kind of depoliticized state, and they are vaguely in favor of the institution of presidency as incarnated by Putin. But beyond that, they're not in favor or against any specific policy. So if the war didn't happen on Feb 24, and instead Putin came on live TV and said, got a very important and happy security announcement to make. I've conducted talks with President Zelensky, who has finally defeated the fascist elements in his country as I perceive them. And because such great progress has been made, we are fully withdrawing and stopping all Russian influence in the Donbass area. And while we're not able to give Crimea back, we're going to give Ukraine $10 billion American dollars as a thank you gesture for the consolidation of their state that has finally resolved our security problems. Now, that's the opposite policy to what Putin did. The support would have been the same. the support for Putin's actions among that 50 to 65% of the depoliticized would have been the same. They don't support the war or oppose the war. They outsource politics to Putin, and they are just, as it were, happy to recognize that somewhere out there is this institution orbiting the political institution of presidency as embodied by Putin. That's all they know. Whatever that institution gets up to is fine as long as it doesn't come for them. And so there is a kind of situation where views about whether a concrete action by your regime is good or bad are things that sort of retreat into the subconscious. And they're there, which is why it's wrong to say Russians don't know what's going on. I think the majority of that 50 to 65% knows what's going on. They know about Bucha, for example. If they didn't, they wouldn't speak to you like this. You know, do you know about Bucha? No, I don't. Nothing happened there. Definitely nothing happened. They wouldn't. They would say, what do you mean there was a massacre? I don't know anything about it. What's your evidence? Show me. Look, that's not the answer. The answer is immediate resistance. And that suggests that they half recognize what's going on. But it sort of retreats into the subconscious, and they are not able to go there. And that's a kind of normalized state that is being, to some extent, challenged by mobilization, because if somebody in your family is being sent to the front, you can no longer have that kind of position. In other words, it's now a bit too real, and you're going to have to politicize yourself to some degree. You could politicize yourself in favor of the war or against the war. So this mobilization is a kind of attack on the normal, if you like, condition. The silly Russian philosopher Dugin would say ontological condition of that 50 to 65% of the population. And we're going to have to see how this works out. I am tempted to say that we need to wait for this mobilization to fail to yield practical consequences that meet Putin's aims, for that 50 to 65% of the population to really begin turning against him. At the moment, they are just feeling panicked and confused, and really under the impression that some rug has been pulled from under their feet, and they don't know where to land.
They must have a sense, though, that there's a problem with the strategy, with the equipment, with the war, or just with the result, because I suspect if many of them felt that they were actually winning, gaining ground, and likely to be victorious, we wouldn't see the flood of people at the borders. So they must have an inkling that it's not going well.
I think that it's two things, actually. So firstly, I mean, quite apart from not wanting to die or kill Ukrainians, apart from that, it's two things. It's that the stories being told about why this war is happening are not immensely persuasive to more than 15 to 20% of the population. But there is then something bigger than this. What is this Ukrainian invasion part of? In other words, it's some kind of presumably big power project or imperial project. What is that imperial project about? Ukrainians have found out that at the moment, what's bizarre about the Russian Empire is that it's a fake empire, because cruel and brutal empires still offer a certain kind of standard. They offer something. They have a vision and some capacity to implement it, as ghastly as that vision might be. It's not clear to Ukrainians that anything is being offered except for violence and territorial acquisition. There's no further sort of clear ideological picture or even picture about modernization. You know, we're gonna focus on building roads, let's say. There's nothing like that. So what Ukrainians have to reject is just violence and territorial acquisition and very vague talk about Russian wealth. But the Russians too are confused about this. What is Putin doing? What is his project in the 20, 30-year window? What is being offered to the world? Does it have some kind of economic story attached to it? Does it have a metaphysical story attached to it? Does it have an ideological story attached to it? And Russians are simply not clear about this, because as soon as you begin to ask a couple of questions about it, it begins to fall apart. So this is not even a cruel and brutal empire that wrongly denies the independence of its neighbor. It's a fake empire. It's an empire with a leader that's operating on a 2-year window of trying to retain power, and then tell stories that aren't coherent even to himself half of the time. And so even as nutty as this invasion of Ukraine seems to Russians, that's not all. They're looking for a wider project there, some kind of a grander strategy than just this invasion, and they're not able to recognize anything. And that is confusing too. And that is going to become increasingly something that 50 to 65% of the population faces, not just the 20% who are opposed to the war. So this is also really interesting. It's not just a sort of a fake authoritarian, totalitarian regime. Even its imperialism is fake in a certain way, because there isn't what you could call an imperial standard being implemented. There's nothing there except improvisation and action. It's almost ideology as action, action as ideology. And so you begin to stare into that, and it begins to look like some kind of a postmodern vortex of unintelligibility.
And of course, during the hybrid war phase from 2014 onwards, and even developed through Georgia, there were some fairly toxic but clever people orchestrating that. Surkov, for instance, is one. Theatrical characters, clever characters, sort of developing those techniques of hybrid war. As you say, what we've got now is not particularly sophisticated. It's no longer hybrid. It's full on, with no clear plan, no power to back it up, and to people on the ground, no clear objective or benefit at the end of it all.
That's a kind of parable of imperial decline and empires decline in fits and bursts. And we have got a situation where bits and pieces are falling off this structure, and anybody who is a neighbor is vulnerable. And what we're going to have to aim at is a conversation that Russians should have with themselves about what comes next, that replaces this sort of vacuous space where there isn't even a coherent imperial conception that we might reject as being sort of racist or awful or colonial. That's the space into which a conversation needs to be inserted about Russia's foreign policy future, the future of Russia's institutions, and the future of Russia's relationship with Europe above all. And that's the conversation that I encourage the Russian opposition to begin having in parallel to the conversation they're having about the necessity for Russia to be defeated in this war. Because what you're going to have is a situation where the incoherence and emptiness of what Putin is offering will become increasingly obvious to more and more Russians. But the answer to that can't just be, we're going to get rid of this and a democracy will magically flourish in its place. That's not what's going to happen. So there needs to be a story there that Russians keep ongoingly constructing with themselves. Funnily enough, that's what Ukraine needs to do after winning as well. But it's a bigger challenge for Russia. And the time to start telling that story is, I think, now, because Russians are going to be increasingly waking up to the fact that what's there on the table now is not really available. It's a story that doesn't make sense. And they've got a regime in a kind of pragmatic survival mode, with a very short vision about surviving for the next couple of years, and tunnel vision about action and escalation being the only sort of ideological commitment in its near abroad. That's extremely dangerous, and the way to tackle it, short of defeating Russia, is to support and encourage a conversation, not just inside the country, but by Russians who are outside the country, about where that country needs to go.
And I think the heart of it seems to me, and I've talked to a lot of Ukrainians recently, and I think that the key difference, and one you've just put your finger on, is that most of the Ukrainians I've spoken to, whether they be sort of journalists or historians, they'll say that they've come a long way, and that the various revolutions have propelled them towards a more complex, more pluralistic society. But all of them emphasize how much further there is to go, how much more work there is to do. And they all perhaps point out different things, but one will say, well, we still need a lot of work on the judiciary. Other ones will say, well, our party political system needs more development. Other ones will say we need more social resilience. So there's a certain recognition that there are still a long way from, well, there is no perfection, of course, in democracy. It's a constant struggle. But they seem to recognize the scale of the problem and the willingness to keep evolving. Whereas I see very little evidence of making that connection, even in Russian liberal news outlets. You don't get many solutions to the problem. You don't have that much talk about the rule of law as maybe a fundamental idea to pursue. They're still perhaps shocked by events, reporting, what's happening, coming to the right conclusions, I guess morally about what's right and what's wrong. You don't get much in the way of tangible solutions being offered.
There are clearly many, many reasons why that's the case, but here is one that's not often articulated, and that's that kind of regime, what we sometimes call, hybrid authoritarian regime or an informational autocracy, is, until it goes too far in a totalitarian direction, where Russia is going now, slowly, but nevertheless, that's the heading. Unless it goes too far in a totalitarian direction, it doesn't actually dislike resistance and protests from the population. It's actually okay with resistance and protest as long as it's piecemeal. What it doesn't like is systemic protests. So let's look, for example, at a lot of the most extraordinary work done by progressive, not in the Western sense of progressive, but progressive folks in Russia who have done a great deal to rescue people from prisons, to change about cases where innocent people were being held up. Dmitry Muratov, the editor of Novaya Gazeta, that for now doesn't exist, has done an enormous amount of work getting people out of jail. His colleague Alexei Venediktov has done the same, who now runs the Gvozd YouTube channel after Echo has ceased to exist. They've done so much to get people out of jail. But why has it worked? It's worked because it's piecemeal. It's worked because they were never fighting for a transformation in how the legal system works, not because they didn't believe in it, because there was no way to fight for that. And so a lot of the major reversals of injustice and tyranny in recent Russian history that have been carried out have all been piecemeal. And the fact that typically the excesses of the regime are also piecemeal has created a culture whereby the first instance is we're going to rescue Barry and Susan, not we're going to take a stand for some kind of procedural principle being implemented in practice. And so we have gone about rescuing Barrys and Harrys and Susans and Sallys. And that tends to be the approach of the Russian population now to mobilization. The preponderance of these protests that you are seeing aren't about this contract has been broken. That's causing panic. But the protests, unless they're protests that are just moral stances that people take, which is what you see in Moscow and Petersburg. That's why the protests are small. I think that people coming out saying this is unacceptable, I don't want to live in a country like this. And they're not gaining anything. They're risking their necks to stand up for a moral principle.
And there's too few of them to reach any kind of critical mass.
Too few of them, and they are engaged in probably expressive politics. They've just had enough of this ghastly regime. But then other people coming out are basically saying, don't take away my son, don't take away my husband, and maybe don't take away other men from my town. That's about it. And so there is this culture of sort of engaging in guerrilla warfare against repression. And it's difficult, therefore, to center a conversation about a systemic objection to how the regime is going. And that requires culture. That requires conversation. And it also requires a sense of common civic belonging, which is what Russia struggles with so badly. We are struggling with it badly too, but in the West, but Russia struggles with it tenfold compared with us. And that's really, really, really difficult. What am I saying here qua Russian citizen, if one were a Russian citizen? How do I stand together with all Russian citizens in this commitment? That's a place they're going to have to explore going, but there's a real problem going there now, and just opposition to the war isn't going to generate any sense of sort of civic belonging, even among the people in Russia who are opposed to the war. You need something positive there, and that conversation is still absent, and it's understandable why it's absent, because a lot of the oppositional Russians in Europe are feeling outrage about the war. They want it to stop. They also know that Ukraine defeating Russia might be good for Russia unless we get a nuclear war. And they also operate in a conjoined informational environment with Ukrainians. I mean, a lot of the war coverage that you see on YouTube, for example, is Russian and Ukrainian folks speaking together. One of the biggest programs is Mark Fagan and Alexei Arestovich talking together. So there is also this tendency that we're going to spend more time thinking about Ukraine than about Russia. And that's problematic because it's not either or, it's both and. You've got to start telling a story about where Russia needs to go. The people who are beginning to do that to some extent in recent conversations are Khodorkovsky and Pastukhov, who are talking to each other on their channel, and they are being very abstract, but at least they're beginning to put together political principles, for example, decentralization of various kinds, which they are discussing as necessary prerequisites for Russia to abandon its vacant imperial project. But we need much more of this and more plurality in this conversation.
That's right. I mean, it's very interesting because the channels you talk about, and there's Michael Naki and there's others with great experts, but they're really covering the day-to-day events, the flow of events, rather than necessarily questioning at a deeper level, how has Ukraine got to this point where they almost culturally will not be owned and dominated in the way that Putin's able to do that, or Lukashenko is able to do that in Belarus. I think there's one or two others like not Dmitry, but Gennady Gukov, who's a former KGB officer. He tends to think in a slightly more strategic way, which you'd expect given his previous job in, I guess, counter-espionage or whatever it was. But yeah, you're right. There's very little of these conversations. And another thing you mentioned earlier, which I think was very interesting, is this idea that the regime will tolerate a certain amount of dissent, but it has to be directed in the right way. So this week we saw Margarita Simonyan and Solovyov, who are two of the key propagandists, talking about arresting and shooting conscription officers because they're cocking up conscription so much. And of course, Western media latches onto this. It's like, this is a huge fissure in, the government. They're splitting, they're turning on each other. No, what they're doing is directing that piecemeal objections, frustrations at local officials, deflecting it away from, the Kremlin. And in effect, they're doing what they've always done. It's part of the propagandist's trick. And yet we see it as some, incredible split in the regime. I mean, they know that the policies, the arbitrariness of conscription is not going to change because of this sort of puppet debate they're having on TV. But they might deflect a little bit of that heat away from their masters. And does that strike a chord?
I think that's completely right. Mm-hmm. And they know what I said earlier, that if you get rid of Putin as an institution, the system collapses, quite frankly. And so because he is the only source of perceived political legitimacy in Russia, to the point that if he dies, he will still be the only source of perceived legitimacy, because the legitimacy of the successor might be, well, it depends when he dies. It might not be so if he dies in quite a while. But if Putin died tomorrow, the legitimacy of the successor will rest in the successor being Putin's successor and somebody picking up the baton from this unique source of political legitimacy in the country, even if the successor does the opposite of Putin and ends the war, funnily enough. So they know that institution has to be taken to be sacred. Otherwise, extraordinary instability is introduced into the system. That's why I'm highly confident that there are no maneuvers to organize a coup at the moment, because of the sacredness of that institution. People know that they are reliant on that institution to live and to move and to operate at the top, which is why it seems to me people around Putin are overwhelmingly likely now to be preparing for a post-Putin future, and even preparing to react to a coup, but they're not planning or producing a coup at the moment. That would be my guess. And that's because they're operating under Putin's cover. And there's something else that's really interesting here, and that's that the Siloviki around Putin have the capacity for political agency as they, as it were, they are tied to Putin, and they rely on his legitimacy, but they have the possibility for independent political agency. But the ultra-nationalist authoritarians don't. They have no political organization. They're not really part of the regime in any way. They are a mob that cultivates the public opinion of the minority of the population. And that's why they are influential and they can create destabilization. But their entire discourse is predicated on being under the cover of this Putinist umbrella, but not just under its cover. What they are saying is everything they say is predicated on outsourcing the final decision to Putin. So I'm trying to, in a rambly way, make a distinction between the Siloviki, who are tied to Putin's legitimacy, but have the capacity for independent political action, and the ultra-nationalists who don't. They simply become like a fish out of an aquarium if you take away this umbrella of Putin's legitimacy, which is why Girkin Strelkov does not directly criticize Putin. It's not just because he's scared or because he could be arrested or killed, which he could be. It's also because there is no capacity in that set of groupings, in these ultra-nationalist groupings, for any independent political action. There are a bunch of talking heads who are cultured into this sense of being protected by the institution of Putin. So if the Siloviki could later on organize a coup, the ultra-nationalists couldn't do anything politically. That's just one distinction. That's why, because I think sometimes when we talk about the two, we mix them together.
And I think this is a very difficult concept for people in Western democracy, or even any other country. In fact, the idea that a single source of power or a single class could essentially write the script for the entire show, and that these nationalist groups like Zhirinovsky's LDPR or others, they have a certain wiggle room to say outrageous things, but they also know where the boundaries lie, and they don't set those boundaries, and they know how far to push it and no further. So in essence, they're given as much license as the central authority of the Siloviki allow them, and no more. So they're not really independent entities in the way, say, political groups or parties or pressure groups would be in the West.
I think that's right. I think about the ultranationalists like Girkin, what I would say is that they would like to have independent agency. They're not serving the regime, but they just can't. There is no way for Girkin to get together with Dugin and organize a meaningful political transformation. Whereas, Bortnikov and Patrushev could. So that's the difference. But I think you're absolutely right to explain to a Western audience that the oppositional quote unquote parties that are part of the system are there to do a theatrical performance that serves the regime, even if it means that they criticize the regime, but they criticize the regime strategically in a way that serves it, by, for example, absorbing certain, things that are out there in the population and taking a hit themselves instead of the regime, or airing some criticism, but at the same time deflating it. So
like a pressure valve, as it were.
But it sounds like a sort of, the whole thing sounds like a quasi-mafia organization that has partial control over this territory. That's why it's so difficult to understand how it works, because there aren't clear principles. I mean, even in Putin's circle, there aren't clear principles of who does what. There are sort of designated scales of importance that different people have, but you often see people doing very surprising jobs that you would never expect a Western political figure in the same position to do. So it's almost like a blend between a mafia organization and the board of a corporation, where there is a hierarchy of a certain kind, but not quite the same clear designated roles. There isn't a chief financial officer. Some of the job will be done by that person, some of the job will be done by somebody else. So it's a messy and fluid and atomized situation, and Putin is keeping it that way. That's another reason why a coup is difficult because the people in Putin's circle aren't that close to one another. Much of their interaction with one another goes via Putin. So that's also another complication. So it's a mess.
It's a massive mess. And I mean, I know it's sort of getting late, but there's one other thing I wanted to sort of touch upon, and it's back on the rule of law. And I think one of the most tragic aspects of this is hearing the stories this week of people with medical conditions, people who have things that ordinarily would exempt them from mobilization. They've got these pieces of paper, they know their rights, they think they live in one type of society, in a bureaucratic but perhaps laws-based society, and of course they turn up to the conscription offices thinking that their legal exemptions are going to be recognized. And as you say, they're essentially kidnapped on the spot, and their legal exemptions or whatever count for absolutely nothing. I think that's tragic. But if there's perhaps one ray of light, it's that Russians will realize the arbitrary system they live within, the total lack of, an independent judiciary, a total lack of the rule of law. That's maybe being optimistic, but that seems to be a fundamental recognition before any progress can be made in reforming Russian society.
I think the people being stolen to the front will recognize that. Nationally, I still think you need the mobilization to fail militarily for people to begin properly waking up. But I think this business of people innocently turning up to these conscription centers is an extraordinary meditation on the passivity, or at least the depoliticization of the Russian population. And it's difficult to talk about it because on the one hand, you've got to tell a sympathetic story about how people ended up in that kind of situation. You can't just say they're passive and that's bad. It's complex. I mean, you've got, as you would know so well from your experiences of that country, such an extraordinary history of punishing proactive citizens, excising them from society, generation after generation after generation. So there's this culture of always lying low and not looking too much at what's really going on politically. Then there is this extraordinary deal that developed between Putin and the population, that he does politics but stays out of their lives. So you've got to tell both a critical and a sympathetic story, and a positive, constructive story about how they get out of it. But just in visceral terms, these are extraordinary images of people going to these conscription centers, and they might as well take their coffin with them. But they think that their medical exemption or some previous document they received months earlier from the same conscription center is going to get them out. And that is an extraordinary meditation on the detachment of that population from what is really going on with their regime. It's quite an astonishing bit of naivety. The regime has wheeled out quite a few fake lawyers to give people bogus advice about this, and the advice has been manipulatively aimed at getting people to turn up to these conscription centers. Somebody has got embroiled in a controversy about this, Ksenia Sobchak, because she had a lawyer on her YouTube channel who said questionable things. And the truth is, of course, that you must not go anywhere near these conscription centers. You shouldn't even walk down the same street.
No, you shouldn't live in the house where you're registered. You should go and live in another address so they can't find you.
And what's absolutely tragic is just how many Russians are naively thinking that they might be protected when they're not. And that's been something that I haven't been surprised by, but I've been shocked by it, because it's just so extraordinary that people would innocently go there. It shows how much that population just tries to look away from politics. And it's another lesson on the extraordinarily painful price of staying out of politics. But again, because of this piecemeal way of thinking about the way one deals with things that go wrong in your society, I still think we need more than just these, incidents of people being taken hostage for the population to begin waking up. We need the whole enterprise to fail. We need mobilization to be seen to fail. And then I think that there could be room for protest, which isn't there now. That, of course, is a difficult question. When does it become effective to protest? Not just from the point of view of trying to get some regional policy changed, that's effective today, or from the point of view of expressing one's moral stance. But when is it effective to protest with the actual aim of destabilizing the regime? And on the one hand, of course, you can't make a sharp distinction between whether protest is effective and whether Russians think it is effective. Because, of course, if 50 million Russians started to think it's effective, it would become effective. But nevertheless, that jump can't be made as easily as some politicians in the Baltic states are currently suggesting it might be made. Because in the end, there is a kind of historical pattern that doesn't always hold true, but roughly, you can take down a highly authoritarian regime before it's formed itself, when it's just beginning. To a certain extent, you could argue Ukrainians did that in 2014. You can take down the regime when it's simply decaying, like the Soviet Union did. Or you can take down a regime that's mature, not decaying, but going through a very big wobble, which is what happened to Lukashenko. And he happened to survive, but he didn't need to survive. It could have gone the other way very easily. And so it's not yet clear to me that any of these three scenarios obtain in Russia. But the truth is that we're moving closer to a scenario of either a wobble or a scenario where the regime begins to grind to a halt, Soviet style, whereby levers are pulled in the Kremlin, but nothing happens on the ground. So we risk both that and the perception that the regime is experiencing a wobble and can be somehow pushed further, which creates this difficult question: what do you tell Russians who are thinking about protesting? I think if you have a moral stance, you just go out there and protest. But if somebody said to me, look, I've got 5,000 people ready to march on the Kremlin, and they're trying to decide if they should or not, I would still say, wait a couple of months, wait a few more months, when that might be more effective. Because at the moment, what might happen is that these people would just be put in jail and they'll be out of action when they can make that transformation. So it's about this judgment of when is the raft built up enough to cross the river. And you don't want to start crossing the river if you have no chance of making it to the other side. And if you start crossing the river without a chance of making it, then people who you'll later need to be there to row are going to sink. But it's a fine balance, because of course you shouldn't just protest when it's an open door you're walking through. So it's this fine judgment. But what is absolutely interesting is that the Russian opposition that's in Europe at the moment are not advocating protest domestically. And that is their key political tool. That is all they know, to the point that I am almost critical of them for not using other tools earlier on. Arguably, there was more room for intra-institutional combat over 10 years ago in Russia. Now there isn't. It's almost as though they said, we do have a couple of toes in the door, we're going to just simply voluntarily take them out and move to the streets. But that nevertheless shows that the streets are the main tool of these folks, and they are deciding at the moment that it's not worth it. Because as depleted as Navalny's network might be, if they decided to have mass protests across Russia tomorrow, they could do it. It would just be very small. So it's not that they can't, but they're choosing not to. And that's because I think they're taking the view that that needs to happen when it has some efficacy.
Yeah. And they had a chance when Navalny was imprisoned. I think it's going to come on for 2 years soon, hasn't it? When he was imprisoned, there were a lot of street protests, and they pulled back from the brink. They decided not to go for a full confrontation, and they didn't do any further street protests once they got quite sort of, met with quite a violent response. And I have the sense that they missed some momentum at that point.
I think it was already late, too late for anything. But what you've got at the moment is a kind of radicalization of the very scenario of protesting, which is moving toward a situation where violent protest isn't going to be necessarily more dangerous than peaceful protest. If in both cases you're going to get 6 years of jail and maybe
Iran is showing that actually large groups protesting violently probably are safer as individuals than small groups of peaceful protests being beaten up.
Possibly safer, if not more effective.
Yes.
So you clearly are moving in Russia to a situation where on prudential grounds, there isn't going to be a vast difference between violent protest and peaceful protest, because both are going to be so brutally punished. And we might see that's where things trend over time. It's hard to make cultural generalizations without a lot of qualifiers. But let me just make one very, very intuitive one. And that's that compared with Belarusians, Russians might be slower to come out, but more aggressive once they are out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's borderline.
I've heard many people say that, actually. I've heard that.
That's borderline an uncomfortable thing for people to hear, but it seems to me to be right. And
doesn't mean that violence is organized. I mean, it could be incredibly intense and destructive, and yet not lead to a structured set of follow-ups. It could just be violence in itself.
For that to not be the case, you need two things. One is leadership, and two is leadership with a clear vision for the country. If Navalny exists and is seen as an authority, whether he is in jail or not, you've got leadership. But you don't quite have a vision, in my view. Sergei Guriev, the wonderful economist who is often asked about Navalny's vision, says, no, Navalny has a vision, and I helped him write his economic program. But my view is that that's true, and Navalny has policies, quite certainly. But there isn't a vision for the future of the country that's tangible enough yet for Russians to hold on to. But certainly leadership he does offer. But you need leadership and a clear picture. It doesn't have to be heavily ideological like Lenin's vision was, but it needs to say, this is where we're going. It's not enough to say we're going to get rid of criminality, corruption, and absolute lack of competitiveness, in the institutions. You need the vision. So leadership plus a vision could make protests more integrated and more effective. And if they're combined with the system just running out of steam, then they'll work. And it's inevitable. I mean, it's inevitable that this regime will collapse. It's just a question of whether it collapses via a wobble or collapses via expiration. These are basically the two scenarios short of World War III.
Yeah. And just the last one to sort of end on, I mean, it's this terrible sense of lost opportunity. I was in St. Petersburg in the 1990s during the first Chechen War, and I remember this exact same scenario. Conscription officers, police, OMON would seal both exits of a tube station so that everybody on the trains coming in had nowhere to go. And then they would check your papers at the escalator. And if you didn't have papers in order, you would be shoved in the back of a van and taken away. And it's a terrible sense of lost opportunity that 30 years later, this same arbitrary, brutal behavior is happening for essentially sort of imperialist and fairly pointless aims.
I am, of course, very fond of Russia in the pre-revolutionary period, not because it was perfect, but because it was healthier and it had the potential for reform. And that was one huge missed opportunity, the 1910s. And it didn't have to go the way of that kind of revolution.
No.
Then we had 1991, and that too was a huge democratic opportunity, bigger than the transition from Yeltsin to Putin. There were opportunities there too, but they were more slender. And these opportunities not being taken is contingent. This is very important for people to understand. They were difficult opportunities to take, but they could have been taken. And sometimes when we see a completely brutal negation of a certain kind of path, a set of values, you think it's inevitable, but it's not. And while it's unlikely and not a scenario that we would ever want for Ukraine, it's not inconceivable that Russia is a more democratic country than Ukraine in 2050. That's not to say that that's my expectation. It isn't. But it is to say that contingency and even the power of individuals makes a very big difference here. If we didn't have Putin, if Putin fell through some pothole, Russia's history could have been different. It didn't have to. It wouldn't have ended necessarily with this extraordinary, brutal war against Ukraine. And so Russia needs to take its next opportunity, having missed the previous two or having missed the previous three. You could even say four, because there was a very reformist project in the 1870s and early 1880s by Tsar Alexander II that also ended abruptly, and Alex II's successor was, short of starting wars, very Putin-esque in many of his policies. So Russia needs to take that opportunity, and it's a contingent thing whether it does, And even some of Ukraine's extraordinary success over the last few months, not just in resisting Russia, but in consolidating its civic sense of itself, is down to some of the actions Zelensky took. And you don't need to be a fan of Zelensky for this. I'm not necessarily a fan of Zelensky pre-war. But Zelensky's decision to stay and not run away is unbelievably pivotal in Ukraine's path toward independence and democratization. So these little pivot points are really, really important. And as much as countries seem to be on rails that inevitably head in a certain direction, they're not quite. And there are always these inflection points, and you've got to take seriously these what might have been questions. To that extent, history is open-ended.
And individuals in this context can still make a huge difference at those pivot points in history, either for good or ill.
When enough opportunity for action arises, and in Russia it will, when this regime begins to really run aground.
Well, Vlad, this has been absolutely fantastic. I know it's now incredibly late in the evening, and I'm extremely grateful for you spending the time to talk. I'd absolutely recommend people to go and see your videos because they're absolutely wonderful, marvelous, and stand to be watched several times over. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Till next time.